I used to think that Reaper was a joke, and I don't mean that I was neutral on it. If I saw someone using it, I would assume immediately that they're just not serious. In my head, it was the DAW for people who didn't want to pay for plugins and who spent more time tweaking their computers than actually finishing music. And that opinion stuck with me for a really long time. Now, what's interesting is I didn't change my mind because of the hype or some influencers or some really aggressive commenters or a YouTube video. I changed my mind because I kept on running into situations where ignoring Reaper no longer made sense. And that is what this video is about. If you pay attention to what's happening in high-level metal production and live touring right now, there's a real generational shift underway. The old standards, yeah, they're still everywhere, but the direction things are moving feels very different than it did even 10 years ago. Stick with me, because the reason for that shift has less to do with money and more to do with how modern work gets done. But before we go any further, here's some context. Reaper is a DAW, a digital audio workstation, the same category of software as Pro Tools, Logic, Cubase, or Ableton. It's been around a long time. It was developed by a small team called Kakos. I think that's how you pronounce it. And it runs on Windows, Macs, and Linux. And for a long time, Reaper wasn't just overlooked in professional circles, it was actively dismissed. It had this reputation as something that serious engineers didn't use, and if they did, it was a red flag. Most of the industry didn't even see it as an option, and I absolutely shared that view at the time. If you don't know me, I'm Eyal Levi. I'm the CEO of URM Academy. I've been a producer and guitarist in my band DAWs since 1999, and I've spent more than 2 decades inside professional studios. I came up on tape, watched Pro Tools take over, and lived through the explosion of home recording. So when I say that I ignored Reaper for a really long time, it wasn't based on ignorance. It was a conscious decision based on what I was seeing at the professional level at the time. But the industry isn't just professionals anymore. There's far more people recording today than there even were 10 years ago. There's band members doing their own demos, musicians who just want to capture ideas properly, and producers working part-time who don't want to build an entire studio just to get usable results. And speaking of getting usable results, this video is brought to you by Nail the Mix. If you want to learn how to mix and master metal, Nail the Mix is the place to do it, straight from the best. Mixers like Will Putney, Buster Odeholm, Jens Bogren, Nolly, TLA, David Bendeth, and artists such as Gojira, Meshuggah, Periphery, Opeth, Nickelback, and over 100 more. At the start of the month, we released the raw multi-tracks from the session so you can download them straight into your DAW and mix the song from scratch. Getting your hands on this kind of source material is an incredible learning opportunity, just so you can see what the standard really is like at this level. Then, at the end of the month, the mixer does a live stream where they break down exactly how they mixed it on the record and answers your questions live. You can also join our monthly mixing competition. Submit your mix, vote for your favorites, and win prizes like microphones, guitars, plugins, gear, and a lot more cool stuff. And your membership comes packed with extras. All the URM plugins, MixLab with over 150 tutorials, Riff Hard for guitarists, and access to our private community on Discord and Facebook. So if you're serious about leveling up your mixes and learning from the very best, check out nailthemix.com today. It's at the link in the description of this video. Now here's where pricing and licensing actually really matters a lot, because Reaper is very, very inexpensive. And that matters not just because people are always hunting for deals, but because a lot of people using Reaper are trying to decide whether or not recording is worth the friction at all. Reaper effectively lowers that threshold. It makes it easier to start, easier to stick with, and easier to grow into over time. At the high end, professionals switch to it because of workflow and reliability. At the entry and mid-level, people choose Reaper because it lets them get real work done without overcommitting. Those two groups end up feeding the same ecosystem, and that's where the momentum starts to build. In the early days of Nail the Mix, like 9-10 years ago, the idea of having one of our guest instructors use Reaper was unheard of. It just didn't even come up. We brought in top-tier engineers, always have, and none of them even touched it. It just wasn't part of serious production education because the people setting the bar weren't using it. Now that started changing quietly, and I didn't notice it at first. The first moment, or the first person that forced me to start paying attention, was Mike Kalasian from Rogue Planet Mastering. Mike is widely considered one of the best mastering engineers working today, and what caught my attention wasn't his sound, even though his sound is great. It was his workflow. The moment a client books a session, scripts kick off automatically, files download, Reaper opens, and everything is laid out exactly where it needs to be before he even sits down. By the time Mike starts working, there's no manual setup at all, and I cannot overstate how important that is. Watching and learning about how Mike works forced me to confront something that I had never really thought about before. He wasn't moving faster because he was rushing. He was moving faster because he eliminated a lot of the grunt work. That grunt work didn't even exist for him in the first place. I was used to sitting down, opening a session, organizing files, labeling tracks, setting things up, and then finally actually starting the job. Mike removed all of that. The DAW was not something that he prepped before working. It was already prepped. What really stood out was that he wasn't thinking about individual sessions. He was thinking about a repeatable system. And once that system existed, every new project just flowed through it automatically. And that's when it clicked for me that a lot of what we accept as normal professional work or just part of the deal is friction that we've been conditioned to tolerate. And once you notice that, the obvious question becomes, why isn't that kind of workflow more common? It's not because of mindset. It has a lot to do with what the software allows under the hood. Reaper is extremely lightweight. It doesn't assume a top-tier machine or a pristine studio computer. Chances are that if someone can't afford a full-price DAW, they're probably not running a top-tier computer. That's just reality. Because Reaper doesn't demand much from the system, it works reliably on modest hardware where heavier software can struggle. Sessions feel less fragile. CPU spikes matter less. The software doesn't become another obstacle you have to fight just to get work done. That kind of reliability on imperfect machines is easy to underestimate, but it creates a very specific outcome. It gives people enough stability and headroom to start pushing boundaries instead of managing problems. Once the basics stop fighting you, or you stop fighting the basics, your focus can shift to experimentation and actually doing the creative work. And that's where the next shift showed up for me. The next person who really helped me change the way I thought about Reaper was the producer, Josh Schroeder.
Hi again, I'm Josh Schroeder.
Most people know him for his work with Lorna Shore, but I'd been following him since his King 810 days. Josh approaches production in a way that's hard to miss. He's constantly bending sounds, rebuilding chains, and chasing ideas that don't fit neatly into default workflows. Watching someone like Josh use Reaper made something obvious. The people doing the most interesting work weren't trying to stay inside the lines. They wanted tools that would get out of the way when they started doing things the software wasn't originally designed for. And that is where JSFX comes in. Reaper lets users write and modify their own audio effects using a high-performance scripting language that updates instantly. You can open the source code and change how your tools behave in real time. Here's the part I missed early on. All audio engineers, or at least most audio engineers, love solving problems and sharing solutions. That is not unique to Reaper. The difference is that Reaper invites customization and has a culture built around it. New users expect to tweak it, they know they'll need help, and they go looking for it. And that expectation creates a demand for shared knowledge. People ask more questions, they trade scripts, layouts, and workflows because that's part of how you're supposed to use the software. Over time, the community becomes an informal support and discovery layer that never really shuts off. The more people who start using Reaper at a casual level, the more knowledge gets shared, created, and refined. And that in turn feeds back into why professionals can trust it for serious real-world work. Customization also plays a very important role that might be kind of easy to miss or at least overlook. Most people don't avoid switching DAWs because they're afraid of learning new features. They avoid switching DAWs because they don't want to relearn how to work. Years of muscle memory get baked into shortcuts and habits that you don't even think about anymore. Reaper quietly lowers that risk. With some setup, you can make it behave close enough to what you already know that your instincts still apply. You're not starting from zero, you're adapting. For instance, there are skins that will make it look and behave like almost any other DAW. So if you get the Pro Tools skin, it's going to be pretty close. And that changes how the decision feels. Switching stops feeling like a hard reset and starts feeling more manageable, even if it's obviously going to take some time. And it's worth contrasting how the industry got here in the first place. For a really, really long time, Pro Tools earned its place for some very real reasons. Hardware integration mattered. Large format consoles, control surfaces, sync systems, and monitoring chains were deeply tied into Pro Tools workflows. In high-end studios, that tight integration was a massive advantage. In those rooms, stability meant predictability. stability. Assistants needed to walk in and know exactly how the room behaved. Sessions needed to open the same way every time. Customization was often a liability, not a benefit. Now, that infrastructure obviously doesn't disappear overnight, but hardware definitely matters a lot less than it used to. Processing power moved to native CPUs, control moved into software, rigs became portable, and the studio stopped being a room and started being a system you could move. As hardware became more interchangeable, the advantage shifted away from deep coupling and towards flexibility and reliability. And that shift really hit home for me with live stability. Stability means something different today than it did 15 years ago. In the old days, if your computer went down, maybe you lost a take, maybe a session got corrupted. Nowadays, if your computer goes down, you've got dead air in front of thousands of people. Live shows are built around laptops, automation, and real-time processing. Patch changes, tempo synced effects, backing elements, all of it has to happen flawlessly every night. Crews are smaller, changeovers are faster, and there's really no time to troubleshoot once the show starts. You know, when everything lives on one machine or even two machines, stability stops being a preference, it becomes a requirement. I was talking to Buster Oderholm from Humanity's Last Breath about this. In the studio, he uses Pro Tools. However, on the road, he runs Reaper. Their live show is extremely complex. There's heavy automation, pitch shifting, wah effects, and constant patch changes. And on top of that, they're not relying on hardware modelers or real amps. All their amp sounds run inside Reaper using amp sims. The entire show lives on a single laptop. And if that laptop fails, the show is over. Buster told me that he runs Reaper live because it almost never crashes, and that was a real wake-up call for me because I'd rather chew on broken glass than trust Pro Tools in a live setting. When DAWs started preparing for our European tour in 2025, I decided to learn Reaper for the same reason. I wanted the smallest possible rig and zero anxiety about reliability. I stuck with the default setup to keep things as stable as possible, and it performed perfectly. And at that point, all the back and forth about which DAW is actually better just didn't matter. Once you've trusted something in a situation where failure is not an option, everything else becomes secondary. And my experience isn't isolated. You know, we run polls inside of URM Academy to see which DAWs people are using. We've done it for years. Early on, Pro Tools dominated at around 60%. Over time, that number's dropped while Reaper and Cubase have steadily grown. Pro Tools is still big, but Reaper is really catching up. And that's because a lot of people today are entering the industry not as assistants through the traditional system, they're learning independently. They're recording bands themselves, producing from home, and building careers without ever setting foot in a traditional facility. They care way less about what used to be the standard and a lot more about what lets them work effectively now, today. They want tools that don't fight them, don't force them into rigid structures, and don't assume a specific room or piece of hardware. And that difference in how people enter the industry changes how they value their tools. And real quick, to be clear, skepticism here is reasonable. No one, and I mean nobody, that means you, should overhaul their tools just because of a video or some trend. Trust is something that software earns over time, usually through hundreds or thousands of hours of use on stuff that actually matters. If your current setup isn't holding you back, there is no urgency to change anything. But the people who did switch didn't do it to be different or trendy because they reached a point where their current tools were either slowing them down too much or adding risk they didn't feel comfortable carrying anymore. Once a tool proves itself consistently under pressure, it becomes really hard to ignore. And you can see this most clearly in environments where complexity explodes fast. One example is game audio, where projects can involve hundreds or thousands of assets that need to be rendered, named, and updated constantly. That's why tools like Reaper's region render matrix even exist. But the lesson isn't about game audio, it's about automation and friction. Every click you don't have to make is mental energy that you get back, regardless of what kind of project you're working on. So in no uncertain terms, what we're watching now is a real shift happening in real time. Modern workflows reward efficiency, portability, and resilience more than tradition. Reaper can run from a USB drive and adapt to how you work instead of forcing you into a fixed structure. I'll leave you with this question. Let me know in the comments. Don't tell me which DAW you use. Just tell me which problem it solves for you that you can't get solved anywhere else. And if you've switched DAWs in the last few years, what pushed you to finally do it? As always, like, comment, subscribe, share, and we'll see you next time.